Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we'll be reading and discussing 3 Kōans. Normally, I discuss Kōans at length and in depth in my Kōan series episodes, but this time I wanted to bring Docs into the conversation and get his impressions on some of these Kōans. We'll be reading and discussing Ordinary Mind is the Way, Not the Wind, Not the Flag, and A Non-Buddhist Questions the Buddha. We hope you enjoy.
Before we begin, I want to clarify how koans are supposed to be used in practice and just do a reality check to make sure that we know what we're examining here. So, we are about to dissect these for meaning. If I recall correctly, a monk or nun confronted with a koan is supposed to meditate on them for extended periods. They come up with an answer or explanation, but are told they are wrong several times by their teachers, and sent to meditate on it even more regardless of the answer. This repeats well past the point of exasperation for the participant, which is part of the point. How close is that? Did I miss any important details?
That's mostly right. The pattern of repeated refusal and frustration is not super common, but does happen at the discretion of the master. The koan is often the first part of a ritualized, highly literarily allusive, with an A, dialogue between master and student, whose purpose is to demonstrate that the student has achieved a realization. The master gives the student the koan, the student meditates and studies until they believe that they have quote-unquote penetrated the spirit of the koan, and then they pick a response from a list of phrases from classical East Asian literature that they think demonstrates thorough understanding of the original koan and poses a compelling dialogic response to it. Then they present that to the master, and the master responds with another koan, or they hit the student in the face, or they fart really loudly, or they remain silent, or any number of other responses, and this starts the cycle over.
So, that's what's supposed to happen. We're about to do it the wrong way, so let's get to it.
Ordinary mind is the way. Joshu earnestly asked Nansen, "What is the way?" Nansen answered, "The ordinary mind is the way." Joshu asked, "Should I direct myself toward it or not?" Nansen said, "If you try to turn toward it, you go against it." Joshu asked, "If I do not try to turn toward it, how can I know that it's the way?" Nansen answered, "The way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. Knowing is delusion. Not knowing is a blank consciousness. When you have really reached the true way beyond all doubt, you will find it as vast and boundless as the great empty firmament. How can it be talked about on a level of right and wrong?" At these words, Joshu was suddenly enlightened.
So I see a few ways to interpret this. First, enlightenment is such a huge and powerful concept that we can't fit it into words or categories. Attempts to do so are counterproductive. The contents are just too big for the container we're trying to put them in. Referring to the way as ordinary mind also sounds like a nod to Buddha nature. The ordinary mind already contains the way. Also, I'm no expert on the subject, but discussing the capital W way and prescribing a relaxed, ordinary mindset to get to it sounds Taoist to me. And also, when a monk has gone through the teachings and done the work to progress on the path, ideally that process includes changing their mind in such a way that it naturally aligns with the Dharma or the capital W way. So a monk who is ready for it should be able to reach it naturally without active effort on their part.
That's all very pertinent and very true. Yeah, so speaking to the boundlessness of enlightenment, that's definitely implied in the part where he says, when you have truly reached the way beyond all doubt, you'll find it as vast and boundless as the great empty firmament. referring to outer space, right? It's infinite in that way. Speaking to the capital W way and the relaxed and quote-unquote ordinary mindset that's involved, that's definitely inherited from Taoism. These names, Joshu and Nansen, are in Japanese, but they do refer to Chinese Chan Buddhist masters, Zhaozhou, and I forget the other one's Chinese name. And Chinese Chan and Chinese Buddhism in general is very heavily influenced by Taoism and imports a huge amount of it into their way of thinking. And that leads a little bit to this ordinary mind and capital W way part of thinking of things. I've talked before on the show about how we have seen that there's the Sanskrit word marga for the path of Buddhism, for the path of the Eightfold Path, for example. But then this gets translated into Chinese whenever Buddhism crosses over into China as the Tao. And that has a lot to do with the fact that this is an interpretive translation that speaks to the capacities and the sensibilities of the people who would be engaging with Buddhism at the time. But that interpretation does railroad the idea into another non-Buddhist way of thinking. And that's implied here for sure. And so we can look at this ordinary mind concept and definitely say that a lot of it is influenced by Taoism for sure. And then to define it, it is kind of like we've seen in other Zen contexts, the beginner's mind or the original face or things like that that we've discussed. This is definitely speaking to Buddha nature for one, and it's also speaking to the fact that we need to remove all calculatory and discriminatory thinking and all mental activities, all sort of acts of consciousness, and not do so in the sense that we are becoming dead, but do so in the sense that we are kind of erasing all of our beliefs, all of our thought patterns, all of our desires, and what's left is what's supposed to be enlightenment. What's left is Buddha nature. And so it's believed, according to Buddha nature and the concept of original enlightenment, that this is how we are already, going back past lives and past lives and past lives into the past. And we have to work backward to get to that point. That's another Chinese Taoist and Confucian way of thinking. Both of them view the Tao as being in the past in some way. It needs to be worked backwards historically or personally in order to be achieved. It's not something that you work forward toward. It's something that you have to go backwards to an original state to achieve. And so that's being replicated here in the concept of the ordinary mind as well. The last thing I want to say about this koan is that I included it because it's very strongly influential in an American form of Zen Buddhism called Ordinary Mind Zen Buddhism. And this koan is sort of like their Heart Sutra or like their Nenbutsu. And they look at it, read it, study it, and contemplate it a great, great deal. And it's because they've interpreted this ordinary mind into a way of living that is self-affirming and into a way of living that is not forcing people to sort of look upon their own desires or their own beliefs or their own thought patterns or their own behavior patterns as bad and worthy of being like shameful about or being like abhorred or disgusted by, but rather as being part of ordinariness. And it speaks to how joy, enlightenment, knowledge, wisdom, realization can be achieved in an ordinary context without having to quit your job, leave your family, leave your house, leave all of your possessions, and renounce and become a monk. So it's very influential throughout history, and especially so in America in the last 200-ish years with this ordinary mind Buddhism.
That makes sense, because the idea of the ordinary mind being the way is enticing in a way. The idea that you already have it, you just need to figure out how to access it, is something that I think would appeal to a lot of people, and that's Buddha nature that is supported by what is in the texts. So yeah, I see why this is such an influential koan in certain sects. There's a lot to dig into here. It says quite a bit in a very concise way.
Absolutely. Definitely. Anything else before I jump to the next one?
I think I'm good. Let's go to the next.
All right. Not the wind, not the flag. The wind was flapping a temple flag, and two monks were having an argument about it. One said, "The flag is moving." The other said, "The wind is moving." They argued back and forth, but could not reach the truth. The sixth patriarch said, "It is not the wind that moves. It's not the flag that moves. It is your mind that moves." The two monks were struck with awe.
So to start with, I think the two monks arguing over the subject is kind of stupid. In the physical world, both the flag and the wind are moving. Why not both? I don't understand the source of this argument. In the Buddhist sense, where it's the mind that moves, this sounds like Yogacara-style mind-only reasoning. Without the senses, including mind, to cognize the flag or the wind, there would be no movement to observe.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. The Yogacara mind-only reasoning definitely is involved and inherited in Chan Buddhism quite a bit. There's a great deal of Yogacara reasoning that is imported into Chan Buddhism because Yogacara really takes off in China around the same time that Chan is sort of forming. And so there's this idea that anything that is perceived or cognized is not actually happening externally, nor is it happening internally. It's actually being perfumed or sort of projected by the mind onto the world and then back into the senses. And that whole process of cognition experience is being determined and modulated by karma. And the point of practice in Buddhism, the point of the Dharma, is to sort of end that process. The definition of that process having ended is Buddhahood or nirvana. So you are no longer projecting and you can see the world exactly as it is. In this case, you can definitely see there's also some sectarian discussion going on here, right? The flag and the wind could be metaphors for anything in Buddhism that causes like sectarian or philosophical or textual debate. And it's captured by the stupidity of the argument. This text says that the flag is moving, but that text says that the wind is moving. And just in that sentence alone, we know that the real issue is being captured in part by both texts. And also, when you add both together, the real thing is still greater than the sum of its parts, right? And so it's true that this is going to come off to people who are reading and who are practicing and who receive this koan. It's going to come off as kind of a foolish and short-sighted discussion these two monks are having. Then the sixth patriarch comes around. The sixth patriarch, his name is Hui Neng in Chinese, and there's actually an entire sutra centered around his patriarchy in Chan Buddhism called the Platform Sutra, and we intend to read and discuss that one in the future. Suffice to say for now, he's a very, very well-respected and enlightened guy in Chan Buddhism. He's very important historically in the lineage, and we'll talk about more regarding that later on. But his idea saying it's not the flag that moves or the wind, it's your mind, that is definitely referencing this Yogacara. And so if you can fully understand how it is that the mind is the one that's moving, then you've kind of understood mind-only reasoning and you've kind of penetrated the spirit of this koan. I also selected this one, I want to say, because it is kind of directly quoted in the movie The Matrix. So if you remember, you have Keanu Reeves going to visit the Oracle to see if he's the chosen one who can like defeat the Matrix. And while he's out in the waiting room, he sees this young girl who's got her head shaved, which is already implying kind of like a Buddhist monastic child. And she's got this spoon that she's like moving around telepathically and she bends it. And Keanu Reeves asks something like, "How do you do that?" And she says, "It's when you realize that it's not the spoon that moves or the spoon that bends, it's your mind that bends. That's when you understand it." And then Keanu Reeves kind of like looks at her and then he gets called back to go see the Oracle. And so this one, again, kind of has its own influence on Western pop culture in the modern era.
Remember, there is no spoon. It's a scene that gets quoted often. So, explaining the metaphorical nature of the argument, the flag is moving versus the wind is moving, being kind of a stand-in for sectarian arguments, that makes a lot of sense because it's a huge problem in the texts. And I wasn't there, but probably in meetings between Buddhists to have these kind of arguments. And again, they're kind of stupid arguments. I could very easily see the sixth patriarch being really tired of this kind of conversation. So that extra metaphorical layer makes the real meaning of the koan a lot easier to grasp. And yeah, it's still a stupid argument, but that's because it's trying to metaphorically represent a stupid argument.
Absolutely. Ready for me to jump into the next one?
Yeah, let's go.
A non-Buddhist questions Buddha. A non-Buddhist, in all earnestness, asked the world-honored one, I do not ask about words. I do not ask about no words. The world-honored one just sat still. The non-Buddhist praised him, saying, The world-honored one, in his great benevolence and great mercy, has opened the clouds of my delusion and enabled me to enter the way. Then, bowing, he took his leave. Ananda asked the Buddha, What did the non-Buddhist realize that made him praise you so much? The world-honored one replied, He is just like a fine horse that runs even at the shadow of a whip.
So this earnest non-Buddhist's quote-unquote question does not make sense to me. Maybe there's a question left out of the koan that the non-Buddhist asked beforehand, and this is a clarification. If his question is not about words or no words, it sounds like he's asking about nothing, a non-question. I don't get it. Either way, perhaps this is a way the Buddha answers a stupid question. And the silence that follows our non-Buddhist gets a minute to think about what he said. Maybe in that silence he reflects and realizes how meaningless the question is, and then slinks away humbled. Alternatively, maybe he senses a threat or admonishment in this silence, the shadow of a whip that he runs from. This reminds me, a while ago we talked about a question that was asked of Joshu. A monk asked him, What is a true statement? And he answered, Your mother is ugly. Meaningless questions like this don't advance one towards enlightenment, so they get a harsh answer. Joshu is less gentle than the Buddha, but also, consider asking a question to someone renowned for wisdom and getting silence in reply. How long does that silence need to linger before it gets awkward or intimidating? In my personal experience, that's not long.
I really like this interpretation of the koan that the non-Buddhist is kind of like asking a stupid question, and then the Buddha is just not answering because why would he? And then the person like slinks away. They're like embarrassed or humbled or something like that. And then it ends with the Buddha saying, he's just like a fine horse that runs even at the shadow of a whip. This is one of those koans that doesn't actually say anything about anybody achieving any enlightenment or realization. That doesn't happen super often. A lot of them will have something relatively nonsensical happen, and then it'll say, and then Joshu achieved awakening, or, and then 100 guys achieved enlightenment, or something like that. And this one doesn't have that. It just has the non-Buddhist asking that question, and then slinking away, and then Ananda trying to see what happened. The idea of this kind of being in the same league, you might say, as the koan where Joshu answered the monk who asked him, what is a true statement, with your mother is ugly, is a great way to connect it to another one. I think that's a really funny interaction in that other text where we see him say that, and that makes this one kind of funny and enjoyable too. My interpretation of this koan is about Zen philosophy of language. So, we've talked about it before. It's been a while, but we have talked about it, that Buddhism has a really interesting and unique view of language. And in Zen, especially, that view can really get complicated. So there's the idea that all words all language, all speech is inherently dualistic because each word is exclusive in its meanings, meaning that it means what it means and it doesn't mean what it doesn't mean. And so dualistic language is thus potentially limited as a means of achieving enlightenment. It doesn't get you anywhere because you can't describe enlightenment. Like we saw in the earlier koan, enlightenment is impossible to fully capture using words. And then the truth of Zen Buddhism is that all experience is impossible to capture just using words. But then silence is also of limited use as well. Silence, or no words, is very limited because it's another form of language. In another famous koan, where the Buddha is preaching to his disciples, and instead of saying anything, he just raises up a flower, and then Mahakāssyapa smiles, and then the Buddha says, out of all of you, Mahakāssyapa is the only one who got it. That's another case where silence itself is a form of communication. Communication's dualistic. It means what it means, and it doesn't mean what it doesn't mean. You have to transcend that dualism and transcend that duality and that conditionedness and that causal nature of language to actually start making progress toward enlightenment, according to Zen Buddhism. And so, in that regard, I think that the Buddha knows that this non-Buddhist kind of had a grasp of that whenever he said, I'm not going to ask you anything with language, but I'm also not going to ask you anything with silence, right? He already opened his mouth, so silence is off of the table, and he's not asking anything that we can really understand with language. So maybe in the actual scene, if this actually happened, maybe the non-Buddhist guy is making a face, or he is having some sort of non-verbal behavioral communication with the Buddha, and the Buddha understands it and responds with still silence. And then the guy gets what he was asking for. And Ananda didn't quite understand it. Ananda didn't fully catch the full meaning and depth of the interaction, and so he has to ask what happened. And then the Buddha replies, making a reference actually to a Confucian text from way prior to the authorship of the compilation of koans that this comes from, The Gateless Gate. He says that he's like a fine horse that runs even at the shadow of a whip. This is a very often quoted Confucian kind of quote that speaks to high training and anticipatory response. And in that way, it's kind of referencing possibly that the non-Buddhist guy understood already. So the Buddha didn't have to say anything in order for him to make the realization, in order for him to understand kind of what they were talking about. If he had said it, then that's not the shadow of a whip, that's the whip. If he didn't say it, and he communicated that meaning without actually explicitly communicating it, then that guy was already very close to the realization, and he didn't need much more. And so that makes it a very interesting kind of koan. Either the non-Buddhist guy is stupid, and the Buddha is responding the same way he would respond to anybody else who's stupid, or he's very, very, very close to enlightenment, and he just needed that interaction to see the last step. And I, of course, included this one, like I said, because of that quote, a horse that runs even at the shadow of a whip. That's a very literarily relevant reference to a different tradition outside of Buddhism.
That's a much more charitable read on it than I would give. I suspect most listeners are familiar with the feeling of asking a question and then after a moment reflecting on that question, being like, oh, I already know the answer to that, and then feeling awkward about having asked that question in the first place. That's what I see occurring here. But to your previous point about this koan not including anybody getting enlightened, like, technically that's not true. The World Order One, in his great benevolence and great mercy, has opened the clouds of my delusion and enabled me to enter the way. The non-Buddhist gets at least closer to enlightenment through this interaction, but that can occur just by taking a moment to reflect on one's words and being like, oh, that was dumb. So it could be either, and the idea of a type of communication happening that we're not able to perceive in this koan because it's beyond language, like, that is possible and perfectly plausible and perfectly within the lines of the religion. But I would also say the response of, this is a stupid question, I'm not going to answer it, is equally within the text's capabilities. So I guess it's depending on how much credit you want to give to this non-Buddhist. And cynical as I am, I'm not inclined to give him much credit at all.
Absolutely, yeah. And since both possibilities are equally possible in this reading of the koan, that speaks to how this koan is very highly subject to the context in which it's being used between the master and the student. So if the master wants the student to come back and give credit to the non-Buddhist, that's one context, that's one form of teaching and transmission. And then, of course, if he wants the student to come back and say that the non-Buddhist was stupid and that this was an interaction based on sort of just someone realizing they asked a stupid question, that's another sort of context. But then there's also the possibility of the context of both simultaneously being true in the reading of the koan. And so a really, really witty or a really sharp kind of response to this koan would be a student coming back with a quote that implies that he realizes the kind of bothness and sameness of our two interpretations, which are that the non-Buddhist is stupid or that he's like on the cusp of enlightenment, and then he reaches it through this interaction. Because we can read both onto this, and because both are equally possible, that kind of changes how we would want to respond and how we would want to understand this and demonstrate our understanding of it. And that kind of orients us toward what should be the spirit of this koan and starts us down the path of thinking about how we would, bring something back if we were given this as a student and our master gave it to us.
Yeah, and someone could be both stupid and on the cusp of enlightenment. I don't see a reason that those are exclusive.
I agree.
All right, well, that was my first time in front of the microphone talking about koans directly. That was interesting. Thank you for bringing these to me. I like this a lot.
Yeah, thank you as well. I enjoyed them, and I hope that we can do some more in the future.
For sure.
This has been our first discussion of 3 koans with docs. I hope you enjoyed our reading and discussion of Ordinary Mind is the Way, Not the Wind, Not the Flag, and A Non-Buddhist Questions the Buddha. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, Nick here, and you've been listening to Bright on Buddhism. Normally at this point in the episode, we would throw to a charity that we think that is deserving of your money or your support. Because there's so much going on right now, we have decided that we're going to open it up to any charity that you think is a good cause to share your resources with. So, if you like our show and would like to support us, please instead give to a charity that you believe does good things for people in need. Thank you.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.